Proverbs 13:20 says, "He who walks with the wise will become wise." I'm Dan Chappa, and Turretinfan and I have been friends for many years, and we've learned a lot from each other, including how to debate opposing views while loving the person. We share a foundation in the essentials of the Christian faith and a love of God and His Word. Here we'll dive deep into the Bible and present both Calvinism and Arminianism and the precise points of disconcurrence. Hopefully the contrast will bring you clarity. Welcome to Disconcurring Theo Amigos. Hey, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
Good. It's always nice to see you.
Likewise.
Yeah. So I saw you had a debate coming up on Marlon's program, The Gospel Truth.
That is correct. We're going to be debating Romans 9, which seems like a broad topic, but hopefully we'll be able to narrow it down to a few salient points of discussion.
I actually also have a debate coming up. It's in October 12th, and it's with Chris Date, and we're going to be debating theological determinism. So I'm looking forward to that. Chris is a very sharp theologian and philosopher, and really expert on ancient biblical languages and stuff like that. So I'm sure it'll be an interesting discussion. I'm looking forward to it. Do you want to dig into the passage for today, which is Romans 11:36?
Yes.
Okay.
And to what I want to point out here is this is the end of chapter 11 of Romans. It ends with an amen. There's a true break between Romans. That amen provides a true break between Romans 11, the final verse, and Romans 12:1, which begins, "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God." So there's a very real break, not just an artificial, for the convenience of the scribes break between chapters 11 and 12. And it's not even just a nice assumption, but the fact that there's this amen here does suggest that there's a real end to a thought. The thought here is it starts in verse 33. And it says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Or who has first given to him, and it shall be recompensed unto him again? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen." And the focus of this that I really had is the all things. I know that it's easy to have these kind of glib, all things means all things. But I do think that there's a pretty expansive, intent behind this, all things. And to give you the other passages that I think provide a similar line in Paul's thought. You have Romans 8:28. It says, "We know that all things work together for good to them that love God." I know we previously discussed that passage, but here in Romans 11, it says, "Of him and through him and to him are all things." So what I think is significant about when you just say, like in Romans 8:28, that we know that all things work together for good, there's a kind of passive way of putting that everything works together for good. It doesn't really say that God is doing any of that. It doesn't. It kind of, it should imply that God's behind it, but it doesn't really say it. It doesn't come out and say it. But here in Romans 11:36, it spells it out in three different ways: of him, through him, and to him. Of him, meaning that everything has its origin; through him, meaning that everything has its I guess I would put it, you could almost look at it as like a past tense, present tense, future tense. Uh, in of him being the past tense, through him being the present tense, and to him being the future. But the idea is that everything comes from him, everything goes through him, and everything goes to him, so that the origin of everything is in God, and the purpose and intention of everything is in God, and also the uh, in Calvinist terms, at least, everything is providentially brought about by God. But it doesn't necessarily, the way in which God brings about different things is clearly different. We see that in scripture. The fact that we call things, certain things miracles and other things not, we don't call miracles, implies that God has different ways of dealing. But all of him, through him, and to him are all things. And I don't think the implication here is that, you know, like, well, some things are of him, and then there's the other things that are through him. Then finally, there's a set of things that are to him. I think the idea is that all things are both are each of him and through him and to him, uh, and that the kind of the result of that is that it's all to the glory of God. Uh,
So I guess before we get to the controversial parts, maybe there's a few things that maybe we could agree on here.
mhm.
Um, so I think for starters, do you agree that this is a different style for Paul at the very end of this chapter, which is at the very end of it, this section 9 through 11 being a section, and it's almost like a song or maybe a prayer or something like that, where he's kind of just because of the wonder of these doctrines that Paul has just expounded on, he's just broken out into praise of God, and that this ending section is just Paul praising God, as if it was a song or a prayer. Do you agree with that in general?
Yes, I think that would be short. My short answer would be yes.
Right. And so he's talking about, oh, the depths of the wisdom, riches and wisdom of God's knowledge, and how unsearchable are his judgments and his inscrutable are his ways. He's talking about, basically God's thoughts are not our thoughts. Like, he has a plan. No one would have thought of this plan. It's not just a genius plan. It's like beyond, I think, um, that's the idea. And I mean, we would probably disagree on exactly on the details of the plan, but in some way, shape, or form, it's talking about the hardening of Israel, and then that leads to the Gentiles being brought in, and then there's some type of regathering at the end of the age. I'm sure we disagree with that on the details, probably not just because we're Calvinist or Arminian, but also because I'm dispensationalist and you're covenant theologian, I suppose. But in general, there's some type of judo flip of the situation that God is doing, where people might look at it and scratch their head and say, "Hey, what in the world is going on?" But God has a plan, and He's going to make everything work out. So, do you agree with at least that aspect, that there's this kind of God is going to reverse the way things look, and everything's going to turn out the way He plans it?
I think that you could view it in a sense as an ode to the wisdom of God and the kind of the inscrutable wisdom of God. I do think that, at least if it's not directly, it's not a direct quotation, I don't think, but it's very similar to Isaiah 40, 30, 13 to 14. The first part of it is, who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or being his counselor has taught him? With whom took he counsel, and who instructed him and taught him in the path of judgment, and taught him knowledge and showed to him the way of understanding? Or sort of similar to some of the answer that God gave to Job, when Job is like trying to kind of justify himself. At some point, God's like, "Oh, really? Were you there when I made Behemoth? I mean, how about when I set the belt that Orion has? What were you doing then? Clue me in here. Give me advice. I need your help with this." So there's certain that, verse 34 about who's known the mind of the Lord or who has been his counselor, uh, and uh, the and the preceding verse about the depth of the riches of his wisdom and knowledge and his judgments and his ways, uh, I do think is an expression in Paul, by Paul, of the huge magnitude of God's wisdom, and the fact that God's wisdom is very, to use a modern analogy, I guess, it's like you see a master chess player who plans a trap, 13 moves ahead, and you don't see it at the time. You think, wow, he just gave away his queen, but then 13 moves down the road, all of a sudden he wins the game. You might, in that case, you might, I guess it's sort of like your judo analogy as well. Yeah, it kind of looks like he's losing something, but in fact uh, he's winning. And that does connect well with the thought in verse 32. God has concluded them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all. Right. So there is that kind of uh, there's this unexpected outcome. The people who previously in time past, the Romans, presumably have not believed in God, but now you have obtained mercy through their unbelief, presumably the Jews' unbelief. So I don't I think that the I think that definitely goes to the kind of the unexpected, supernatural, mind-blowing wisdom of God. And then, verse 35 is not quite the same thing, although it does tie in. There's some ways in which it ties into the preceding discussion, but 35 says, or who is first given to him, and it shall be recompensed unto him again. It's like, do you think God owes anybody any debts? Like,
yeah,
I mean, come on. It's
yeah,
not like,
yeah, but I think this one also has cultural impacts, right? Like the difference between art, like, if I were to give you a birthday present or something like that, I'm not expecting anything back, right? So, but I guess especially in Roman culture, that was the way things worked, right? You'd give gifts to kind of put somebody into obligation to pay you back, but that's not the way God's grace works. And but it also highlights in essence like that God takes the initiative, right? That God is the one that starts everything. It's not that we start anything. And you know in essence it's a more pure form of grace rather than a gift to get something. No, it really is a free gift, and that's given to us.
it is a free gift that's given. I think though this is asking about. I would interpret 35 as saying, remember, kind of like in the other. There's another place where it says like who's gone up into heaven, or who's descended down into hell. The idea is like what human being is there that has somehow, you know, built up credit with God, so he's receiving payments from God for this.
Sure.
Yeah, I do think that it's a little bit of the first given to him. May you could view it either as a loan or as a bribe, and even in ancient times there's not a huge difference between those two things. Even in modern times, there's a reason why you can't go and give a lotus esprit to a government worker, unless you have somebody, unless there's some exception, like, I don't know, it's your spouse or something. But I don't know all the exceptions. Don't just go around giving gifts to federal government workers. The point is that there's concern
Yeah.
even today that if you give gifts, it corrupts judgment, because it creates an unwritten. Even though there's not really a contract there. There's a fundamental wiring that people have that there is some kind of contract there. And even so, I mean, the idea is, I think, in 35, that there is that nobody is smarter than God. Like no one God didn't have to go to anybody for advice.
Right.
He's fully able. He made all these decisions himself, and is basically he's smarter than anybody else. He's figured out all these things himself. He didn't do this because he owed anybody anything. It's not like that, Adam, somehow did this amazing thing and now God owed him. So fine, Jesus is coming to provide this way of salvation because God owed Adam. No, it's all of this is free from God. But then the answer to 35 and to 34 is 36, which is
Sure.
that all things are of him, through him, and to him. And I'm not sure if from what you were saying, if you wanted to limit the all things here contextually to all things that pertain to salvation, or if you wanted to expand it to all things absolutely.
Sure. So actually, I'll make one quick point before I'll dig into the 36 itself. But so you mentioned Romans chapter 8, for we know that all things work together for good for those that love him. I think there's similarities, but I think there's also pretty big differences. I would refer that specifically mostly to God's security and governance. It does pertain to God's providential governance, but it primarily pertains to the security of those that love God. But this doesn't have an upfront condition in there, like it's not for those for those that love God. This is more universal, right? For it, it's all things in that sense, and it's. To me, it would be more similar to, I think it's in like Hebrews 1:3, or I think in Acts 17, in him we live and move and have our being. It's one of those types of expressions. Okay, so let's take it piece by piece. So the of him, it seems very clearly to be anchored in creation itself, right? Nothing would exist if God didn't. God exists, he's eternal, but everything else, everything that's not God, is from God in that sense, right? He created it out of nothing, and it would be nothing if it wasn't for God's creating it. So 100%, I don't think we're going to I don't think we necessarily would disagree on that point. Now, maybe you think of him means more than just God created those things, but I think we could at least agree that God created those things, and that's why they exist. Okay. All right. Now, through him is the interesting one. And so now let's handle the easy one, the to him, the goal. So the goal in creating everything was God himself, right? It was for his glory, for his praise. That's, everything has its end or goal in God. Now, how exactly that works and fits, we'd have to wrestle to the ground. I think it's very clear to say that, that's the purpose of life, and we can see that in like Ecclesiastes and that sort of thing, that, that should be our primary focus and goal in life, to glorify God. Now, how exactly that works, I guess in the case of on predestination, especially the reprobation, is I would think, a little tricky, right? Like, I think you would have to wrestle with the two wills of God sort of thing, because in some sense, perhaps you could say that, well, they glorified God because he gets to punish sin, and that's what he wants, and he's going to obtain his glory in that way. But they don't glorify God in their good works, because ultimately they violate at least his commands, in some sense, forever. So I think that would be a little bit tricky. I'm not sure. What do you make of the teleological goal of those things which end up in hell forever?
Yes, I think that they show God's wrath, and and that is one of the, according to Romans 9, at the way Romans 9 kind of words it, what if God was willing, wants to do this, but the implication in my understanding is that God is saying that is what God has in mind. He wants to show his mercy, and he also wants to show his wrath. He shows his mercy on those ultimately in heaven, and he shows his wrath ultimately on those in hell. And they both serve a purpose as it relates to God. It's not a very positive thing as it relates to those humans in hell, or to Satan himself and his angels who are in hell. It's not a positive purpose focused on them. So if it was that all things were to those people, to Satan and his angels, and to those who never believe, it wouldn't be accurate to say that those things are to their benefit or to their happiness or their glory.
So, okay, let me ask it a different way, because maybe I'm being less than clear. So you're a Westminster guy, right?
Yes.
So the Westminster, doesn't it say the purpose of life is, to glorify God and serve him forever?
It actually says that the chief end of man, it's the highest purpose.
The highest purpose of man is to glorify God.
To serve God and to glorify him forever.
Okay. So is that their chief end if they're rebelling against God eternally and being punished for it in hell? Like, how does that square?
So none of us fully serve God in the sense of obeying his commandments, not even the ones who are saved by God's mercy. And although we will glorify him, although everyone ends up in some sense glorifying God, either through being, glorified and then ultimately serving God and glorifying God as an expression of God's mercy, or glorifying God in the sense of being an expression of God's wrath. But no, not everyone not everyone achieves that chief end. In fact, the only person who achieves that chief end is Jesus Christ. The highest end, yeah.
So in some sense, they don't glorify God in that way as much as they should.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Otherwise, there was no law.
Right. Yeah. So in that sense, in this sense of to him are all things is a different sense than that, right? It's the to him is some type of goal, but it's a different goal than that goal, because that goal is the obedience of God's commandments, what things should be. And this to him, this goal is satisfied and achieved whether they obey his commands or not. Right?
Yeah, it doesn't have to do with, we're getting a little bit out of obviously out of the text itself, but I do agree with that point. In other words, I do agree that the to him are all, that all things are to him here doesn't mean that there's only sinlessness in the world.
Okay. Yeah. I get what you're saying. Okay, fair enough. We can move past that point. So let's circle back to the through him. Well, it's not quite clear what the through him means, and because of that, I'll offer you two different takes because I'm not 100% sure on it. So if we take this in the broadest sense of all things, like literally everything everything in existence, then this definitely it pertains to God's omnipresence, providential control, that he's directing everything and that sort of thing. And I think it would also tie into what a lot of people view as the doctrine of concurrence, which I think is biblical and true, which essentially is that it's not just that God created us and then just kind of left us on our own momentum, so to speak, to continue existing, but He sustains us. He upholds us continually at every moment, so that it's not enough that God just created me, but He has to sustain me and keep me in existence. And if He doesn't, then I stop existing. At the moment that He stops concurring with my existence, I suppose would be one way to say it. So I think if you take all things in that broadest sense, which could be, because again, this is a hymn of praise, then that makes the most sense to me, that it's talking about God's omnipresence, providential control, His concurrence with everything's existence, and His general plan and direction for the world.
So I have to acknowledge up front that one of the trickiest areas of Greek is article usage, but the second, like unto it, is preposition usage, because of the fact that it's very hard. A lot of times, it's very hard to map prepositions between languages, even though English is a pretty great language, hurrah for English, but it doesn't exactly map to Greek. So, for example, the from of him is ek, and then the to him is ice. So, but there might be times when to is not the word you'd use. You might use into, but saying into him here really wouldn't convey the right meaning. And where ek can mean it can have a number of different translations. Sometimes from or out of, but again, out of him wouldn't really make a lot of sense. So the same is true, maybe even more so, about this dia preposition that's used here. It's just in the form, I think, d, but anyway, it seems to have, in my understanding, usually some kind of causal connection to the thing, a channel, like just using kind of Strong's. If you go to like Strong's definition, it will say something like, I think it says, hold on, it says, denoting a channel of an act. It doesn't, and then I think you see probably something similar in Thayer's, probably, although Thayer's is more extensive. And you'll see, like, in a lot of preposition use kind of depends on the context. But I think the point is that this is an instrumentality. This is the sense of the through here is one of instrumentality, not merely of I don't know, maybe what you've said is enough to imply instrumentality, but I feel like it's not. I feel like you're trying to, not trying to, but you're sidestepping the instrumentality aspect by saying that by saying concurrence, instead of saying instrumentality, because yeah.
How do you cash out the instrumentality that you see? What do you think Paul is conveying through this dia, essentially through him? What do you think he means by that?
I think he means, well, I think he's implying meticulous providence. Whether you can cash out all of meticulous providence from just that one preposition and the fact that it's used in this context, I don't know. But that's what I think, yeah.
So I agree with you on meticulous providence, but what else? Or do you think it means causal determinism, or are you okay with just stopping short at meticulous providence?
Well, I'm probably okay with stopping short at meticulous providence and just fighting another day on whether meticulous providence itself then implies some kind of determinism, and what's the difference between causal determinism and non-causal determinism, and how is such a thing as non-causal determinism even a thing. But that the but the meticulous providence is the key. And i I see this expression uh, as very parallel, this triple preposition expression of him, through him, and to him. I see that as expanded as a compressed form of what he used in his Mars Hill sermon. Do you mind if I read the snippet I think I mentioned to you?
Yeah, that's fine. Go right ahead.
Acts 17:24 through 20, I think through 24 through 26. Let me just pull up and make sure that's the right. Uh, yeah. Uh, well, so I'll start at 23. It says, "As I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription: To the unknown God, whom therefore you ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you." So this is just a reference to uh, in the in Athens, there were they thought basically they wanted to they want to irritate or anger any of the gods, and they figured that there are so many gods they might have missed one, so they made an altar to the unknown god just in case. That way, whichever god this is couldn't be too angry because at least he had been worshipped, and they're covering their bets basically. But in fact, they didn't know the true God, and so in some weird sense, this altar was an altar to the Lord. And so he said, you worshiped him ignorantly, but I'm declaring him to you. And now he explains who he is. And he says, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is the Lord of heaven and earth, dwells not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything. And before I go on, so I see 24, especially this first part, God that made the world and all the things therein, as equivalent to the from him, or the ek auto, the first prepositional item. Uh, and then it says, it's neither worship with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he gives to all life and breath and all things. That's what I see as, well, let me continue on. Seeing that he gives to all life and breath and all things, and has made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth. So at least to that point, I see that as very similar to the through him. And then has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. I see that as to him, in some sense, very similar to the to him point, that they have, that man is not, man's teleology is not anthropocentric. It's theopocentric, where we should have a God focus. We should think about our purpose and our existence as being in service and glorification of God, not in the service and pursuit of ourselves. And so God made all things. He gives us a life and breath in everything we have, and he has decreed everything that's coming to pass, in terms of when he says that the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. I interpret that as meaning a claim that God is in control of history. So that in some sense, that's the in some sense that's really the part of that second, the present tense aspect that we were talking about. But then that they should seek the Lord. Again, that's the part that's focused on the purpose of man. And therefore the third of those phrases. And then in verse 28, you mentioned this earlier, I think, in our discussion. For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. And then that in him we live and move and have our being, I tie into that second prepositional phrase, through him. And then for as much then as we are the offspring of God, we shouldn't think the Godhead is like gold, silver, or stone. And that we're the offspring of God there is really a reference back again to the fact that God's the creator of everything. And that at the time of these times of ignorance, God winked at, but commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day in which he'll judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he has ordained, whereof he has given assurance unto all men in that he raised him from the dead. That's the to him again phrase. That the purpose of humanity is focused on this coming judgment day. They didn't care for his claim about resurrection of the dead. Obviously, we hear about that. But anyway, I tied it in there because I think that the idea of that the two of him ek auton, being that he is the creator of all things. I don't think you and I are that different on that point. I think we both acknowledge that God is the creator of all things. There's not some other creator.
Yeah, right.
and we also, I think we're mostly on agreement about the eis auton, that the to him, that everything has a God. There's a God focus to everything, and it may be just this through him that where we have a difference. But that's where I wanted to emphasize that one, because in some of our discussions, I felt like it was almost as though there was a dichotomy between who we are and what we do, such that God can kind of decree who we are and can create us, but there's this idea in certain ideas of free will that he's not somehow in control of what we do in the same way in which he was in the control of who we are.
Yeah. So thank you. Okay. So and I think we are digging into the point of maybe this disagreement, because there was so much of that you said that I actually agree with. In fact, I was really searching for where I might disagree. Okay, so let me see if I can state it this way. 100%, I do make the distinction between actions and an actor, right? They cannot be actions without an actor. They can't be choices without an agent making the choices, right? That much is clear, and I don't think you would disagree with that. There is an existence between a difference between existence and action, right? And action is the things which exist are doing something, but it is the things which exist that are performing those actions, and there can't be actions unless those things exist. So now I do think it's talking about that God has created us, so he's the source of our existence. Let's see, but then it goes further than that we're going through him, and then the other passage, in him we live and move and have our being. And I do think there's this sense of God upholding us, and we are maintaining our existence is entirely dependent on him. And it is a cause and effect relation, in that if God is not causing us to exist, we will not exist. So it is that sort of a causal dependence on God, for sure, 100%. So I guess where we may disagree is, well, the things that he's upholding in existence, they may themselves have God-given abilities. to do things, and God doesn't, at least directly, cause those things that we do, right? And I think you would. Oh, actually, so maybe you do, or maybe you don't. So let's talk that through, because we started to talk about it, and we had this same issue in our conversation on Molinism. So this is important. So let me see if I can paint two different models. So you asked the question, what's the difference between causal determinism and non-causal determinism, right? Right. And we kept going back and forth on, is this an aspect of God's free knowledge or his middle knowledge? Okay. So let me lay out two different models, and let me see which sounds better to you. So one is that it's closer to, I guess, like John Edwards, or maybe even Turton or something like that, where, basically in a human being, our intellect determines our wills, right? Such that, we can't choose different than our greatest desire, our strongest motive, the last judgment of the intellect. They put it in various different ways, but it was this sort of causal chain inside a person that originates from outside a person and then just moves into the person. But in essence, that and I know you probably wouldn't like the word dominoes, but it's kind of like cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect. Starting from, I guess, creation and moving right on through, and everything happens exactly the way it's caused to happen, and it can't be caused otherwise. That's causal determinism. Now, there's another Calvinist view, but it's more rare. But I think it was Mullenbranch. But anyways, there's something called occasionalism. And what occasionalism says is it looks at cause and effect relationships, and it says, well, it looks at, like, I guess what David Hume would have talked about and said, okay, well, we see this relationship, every time we see fire, the paper catches and, starts to smoke and then disappears, but what is this? All we see is the fire and the smoke. We don't see necessity. We don't see that it must burn. We just see every time that this happens, it happens, and we just have a mental expectation that it's going to continue happening. And what occasionalists said is, well, God is what steps in and makes, and is the cause and effect relationship. And, every time there's a, let's say an agent making a choice, God at that moment causes it to be, and not just causes the agent to continue to exist, but is the cause of the agent choosing what it chooses. And that's what I understand occasionalism to be. So it's kind of a stronger causal determinism in a sense, because God essentially is the cause of everything directly. So for starters, do you see the difference between these two types of determinism, and which would you hold to?
Okay. Well, I do see the difference between those two. I should acknowledge that I was mostly being facetious about by saying non-causal determinism, because usually people aren't offering non-causal determinism as the alternative. Usually, it's kind of a what's the right word? It's kind of a way of trying to get in a little bit of a slam on determinism by making it sound more mechanical or something like that. Which, in fact, I've also heard mechanical determinism and things like, terms like that. Even with occasionalism, where you have the idea that if the relationship between cause and effect is just in each instance particularly carried out by God, it changes the way in which cause and effect work. But then again, who is it that has decreed that cause and effect? Even if you don't if you don't do it as an occasional view, even if you have it only as a general view, still you have to say that the fact that there is laws of cause and effect, when you apply it to the physical world, setting aside moral agents because of the controversy, when you look at the physical world only, you see that there are laws of cause and effect, or we believe there are laws of cause and effect.
Yeah,
And
I'm sorry, on occasionalism, there isn't. It's just God.
right. I'm saying setting aside occasionalism.
Yeah.
But if you say that there are laws of cause and effect, you still have to ultimately, they don't have their origin outside of God. So if there are laws of cause and effect, they come from God. And if it's occasionalism, then there's not general laws of cause and effect. It just all comes from God. But that might cash out to almost exactly the same thing, because either way, it's from God. Whether it's just because the laws of cause and effect are from God, or whether because God, visits each occasion, makes a judgment, and decides what's going to be the outcome. But in any event, with it, in the case of the physical world, in the case of physics, in the case of biology, generally people are pretty comfortable with the idea that for every effect there is a sufficient and efficient cause. And it's not troubling that the same, banging your flint on a wooden table doesn't produce a spark, but banging it on a steel table produces a spark, even though it's the same banging and two different effects are achieved. Because there's no moral issues that are associated with it, it doesn't muddy the thinking at all, and the result, the two different results from the same action of banging with flint are, everyone kind of sees that it just makes sense, because when flint hits steel, some kind of reaction occurs and electrons are freed and a spark is emitted. Whereas when flint hits wood, there's no similar reaction that occurs, and therefore no electrons are released, and therefore I don't know exactly the chemical reaction, whatever it is that causes a spark. I'm going to need to mute myself for 1 second. So whatever it is, I think that when it comes to human beings, there's more difficult. There's a model of human beings that treats them as though human beings are all identical wood tables, and someone's banging a flint on all of them. And in some cases, it's sparking, and that's because of divine intervention, as opposed to some people being wooden tables and some people being steel tables, and the ones where it's sparking, it's because it's a steel table. And if you're looking at it in terms of tables and sparks, no one has a big problem with the fact that different tables produce different reactions to flint being smashed on them. Whereas when it comes to human beings being faced with temptations, there's a fundamental dislike of the idea that human beings don't have this, what's often called this kind of contrafactual power, or a causal power. I don't know the best term for it, but the idea that you could have done differently than you did.
The choosing, that they can choose things.
That's not the problem that people have. The idea that nobody seems to have much of a problem. Nobody seems to have much of a problem with the idea of people actually choosing things. It's the problem. The problem is that people feel like they could have chosen something different.
Yeah, of course.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
And
so,
yeah,
So okay. So I think with people, they'd not like the tables or fire to paper or something like that, in terms of the sheer regularity isn't there. Now, people have habits and that sort of thing, but in general, it's a lot harder to predict. And so the question, I guess, could be, well, are people just way more complicated than fire and paper? Um, or is there a reason why there isn't this established regularity? Why is it that, one day, you know, I drink coffee and the next day I drink, iced tea or something like that? Um, there's, we don't have the establishment of a pattern of, well, if this is there, then that's there. And it's not that way with people. Now, people have their preferences and, what things that they like, and they tend to go back to them and stuff like that. But there's not that established regularity. But I guess I come back to, so let's take that difference between occasionalism and just general causal determinism. I get what you're saying, that they're both through him in one sense, but they're different in very different ways. Because in occasionalism, God is kind of on the spot, stepping in, and he establishes like the cause and effect relationship right then and there. So in that case, if occasionalism were true, all counterfactual statements would be grounded. It would have to be God's free knowledge. It'd have to be. But if causal determinism is true, and it's like a set of dominoes, then that is already established when God sets the laws of cause and effect. So what will, Dan Chapa do if he were in Starbucks right now is something that God had already causally determined. And the fact that if he creates me, and if he sets the laws of a certain way, and that circumstance is sufficiently defined, then you could just calculate it. And so that's would be part of God's natural knowledge. Not to re-debate that debate, but that's exactly why I was taking the position of, well, no, it doesn't belong over here, it belongs over here, right? It is because of the difference between occasionalism and causal determinism. So where does that leave us? I guess it sounds like you're not taking this text as an explicit state of causal determinism, and that seems wise. What it's not saying is God is causing every action that is to happen, including all the sins of every person ever. It doesn't say they can't do otherwise. It doesn't say that these things are necessary given God's causation of them. It just doesn't load all that freight into this text. So it seems wise not to say all that. But then if you don't press this text to the point of some type of causal determinism or occasionalism, then what are we disagreeing on?
Well, I'm glad to come back from the tangent. Almost before we got back to all the way back to Romans, the one phrase I wanted to particularly highlight again in 1728, in Acts 17:28, was the in him we live and move and have our being. And I was agreeing with you when you said earlier that, yeah, there's a difference between the actor and the action, and that there's a difference between existence and action. But I think that there's I'm trying to think of the right word to use here, but they're put all on the same plane by this way of speaking. When Paul says in him, and again, there's this preposition in, but it's not like it's at some location, but it's more like by his power. In him we live and move and have our being. They're all put on the same level. So our very existence, the fact that we continue to live, and the things we do, we live, we move, and we have our being, are all put into that same bucket, even though they are different things. Like the fact that we're alive is different from the things that we do, is different from the fact that we exist. Those are three different things, but all of those are in him, meaning by his power. And in my understanding, if this gets us back to Romans 8, it's this through him. And the idea is that there is an instrumentality of God to all of these things. Whether we want to label that instrumentality as something more than meticulous providence, if it just turns out that we just agree that, well, it means meticulous providence, but then we just have some disagreements about what exactly is included in meticulous providence, or how does God bring about meticulous providence without injury to the creature's free will, which we also interestingly agree with. I mean, you don't think that God injures man's free will, and I also think he doesn't. It's just, of course, we mean something a little different by free will. But maybe we just have kind of an agreement, or a mostly concurrence in the discussion. But I feel like the sense in which that he's saying through him here, of him, through him, and to him are all things, and then tying that together with to whom be glory forever. To me, that means more than just that God has signed off on what's happening, and again, it may be that you're perfectly okay with saying that not just that God signed off on it, but that God has, in a very real sense, approved of, and is in a very real sense controlling what happens, but just that he's controlling it without the use of what you describe as causal determinism. Of course, the term causal determinism isn't a scriptural phrase, and it's one of those. That's one of the reasons I'm a little bit shy to say, okay, well, this says causal determinism. I can show you places in scripture where it looks like the Bible is talking about causes and effects for human actions. And if there is causes and effects for human actions, then it seems like there's some kind of causal determinism, even if you don't want to use that expression. I think that occasionalism is kind of an interesting philosophical novelty, but that it's not there's nothing in scripture that would make us think that that's how God, runs the world. So now I did not take you as suggesting that you're holding to occasionalism. That's correct, right?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So setting aside that other sense, it seems like if you have God saying that all things are of him, through him, and to him, then it's as though, and also when you go back to the Acts 17 passage about in him we live, move, and have our being, it seems like God's taking credit in a very real sense, not only for the bare existence of his creatures, but he's also taking credit in a sense for their actions, for their continued life, and for their actions as well. Not that he's taking moral blame.
All it says is, "In him we live and move and have our being."
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, in him.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So yeah, I mean, obviously, we both hold to omnipresence.
But that's not what it means. That's not in him we live and move and have our being. Doesn't have anything to do with where God's presence is.
Why not?
Because it's not about location.
It absolutely is. Movement changes your location, but you're still in God.
That's not what in him has to do with. It doesn't have nothing. It has nothing to do with location. It has to do with power.
Where are you getting that from?
The use of in the New Testament.
So, Okay. All right. I mean, I'd be interested um, to find out that I'm wrong about that. That in doesn't mean location. I understand that in is that preposition is flexible, and we talked about it already, like how prepositions are tricky things sometimes, and that's okay. Um, and I don't have a problem with the overall idea that you're suggesting, that it has a providential sense, and that's certainly the case. That everything falls under God's governance and direction, and just doesn't need causal determinism to do that. Um,
So if you're looking for the like in Thayer's, if you're looking for that where that would be found, you just look down in there. Of course, there is a sense in which in does match to n
Location.
in Greek does match to in English in terms of having a location, like within some limits or something like that, in a city, for
Right.
example. But there's also other meanings, and those include ones that are based on, and if you go down here, it's listed under uh, uh, used of that with which a person is surrounded, equipped, furnished, assisted, or acts. Uh, and like of the instrument or means by which, this is basically 5D in the list there. It says that of the instrument or means by which anything is accomplished, owing to the influence of the Hebrew preposition, much more common in the sacred writers than the secular authors, where we say with or by means of or by or through. Uh, and then they
Right. But
give some examples.
the context of Act 17 is the boundaries of nations, right? Let's see. In verse 26, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and their boundaries of their dwelling places, that they should seek the Lord, if perhaps feel their way towards him. Yet he is not far from each one of us. So you have the boundaries of their dwellings, the determined allotments. He's not far from each one of them, right? For in him we live and move and have our being. I mean, the context is pretty strong that this is the normal sense of in terms.
I mean, even in Thayer's, if you go down and look, one of the examples that they give for of that in which other things are contained and upheld as their cause and origin, one of the examples is given as Acts 17:28. In God is found the cause why we live. So I maybe it sounds like I'm just making this up, but it's a real thing. And I'm pretty sure that it's not, it doesn't
Yeah,
have to do with the
no,
place where we are.
no, but I think what you need is an argument as to why that sense is to be preferable to the location sense.
Well, okay,
It,
my first argument is because Thayer said so,
okay,
but I know
fine. That's fine.
that's not the whole argument.
Yeah.
Basically my point is that it's not. I'm not trying to. This is not my own crazy idea. Uh, it. I'm actually a little bit. Uh, I am a little bit puzzled. I guess I'm not as puzzled, but I'm just a little bit surprised, I guess.
It's not the idea that I'm objecting to. It's that idea is here. I mean, even if you, let's say you're right, it's certainly not a problem. Because I hold that God's providence governs everything, and that God is the source of every life and ultimately the source of every action. So I have no problem with that.
Okay, so here's my argument then for this specific use or that specific meaning in this specific case.
Okay.
Aside from the argument from authority, which can be flawed, by the way. I mean, I'll be the first to acknowledge that just appealing to the fact that that Thayer's used this verse as an example of that meaning doesn't really prove that it's so. It only proves that you should at least consider it as a possible thing, not that it automatically proves it. So setting aside just the Thayer, maybe Thayer is a Calvinist, I'm not even sure. It doesn't really matter. For in him we live and move and have our being. And then in Paul's argument, the next point is, as certain of your also of your own poets have said, the point that he's making from their poets should be the same point that Paul was just making. And he said the point he makes from their poets is, we are also his offspring, not we're also surrounded by him, or we're not we're also close to him, or we're also nearby. Although I can see that, if you look at the previous one about he's not very far from us, you might think that it's more of the location aspect, because God's omnipresent, therefore we're not, he's right, next to us. But the fact that it's saying we're also his offspring is the reason. It may also be what I could be wrong, but it might also depend on whether which form of the pronoun which declension the pronoun is in, whether it's in the dative or not. I cannot remember. But that would be the idea here, is that if the point of his argument is about the location of God, then we're his offspring doesn't say anything, because their poets thought that there's a sense in which we're God's offspring, but they didn't think that God was nearby. They thought he's out on Mount Olympus, right?
So it's a good point, and I hear you. So if his summation of the point is, for we are indeed his offspring, that has to do obviously with creation, but not just creation, but a relational type, creation, that he's our father, and he is the father of all people in that sense. But I don't think it's decisive. Again, I come back to where Paul starts from. Yet he is not actually far from each of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. Like, how does the point of that God is, let's say deism was true, which is not, but let's say deism is true. The fact that God created the world doesn't really mean that he's not far from us. Right, so this is a tremendous text to stomp deism to the curb, I suppose. But it,
well, on deism, in him we live. In other words, by his power we exist. We were brought into existence. But, or maybe in his power we have our being. But we live of our own accord and we move of our own accord, on a deistic way of looking at it. But I think that when he says not that we should seek God, feel after him and find him, though he isn't far from every one of us, I think that the primary sense that Paul has in mind of not far is less about how many meters and more about God's, as I think you were saying, his relationship to us. And it's a relationship of creator, as most principally, but also as a provider.
Yeah. Okay. So I think,
in other words, you could be an omnipresent. You could believe in deism theoretically and hold to an omnipresence, but you wouldn't have God's just omnipresent and he created everything. He just doesn't care, or maybe he cares, but he's just not going to be bothered.
Yeah, we wouldn't be his offspring, and at least in that stronger sense. Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with your overall point. And hear me out. I'm not saying that people can move if God doesn't want them to move, or the opposite, like they would have any motion at all if God wasn't behind that motion or movement. Of course not. That's not what I'm saying at all. So I don't think we're that far apart on that sense. I'm glad we went down that trail so I could hear your line of reasoning. and it's a strong line. I had previously taken this more in an omnipresence type sense, but I don't deny that there's it really, to me, is what's explicit versus what's implicit, right? I had previously thought explicitly it's talking about omnipresence, but implicitly it's talking about governance. But maybe it's explicitly talking about governance and implicitly talking about omnipresence. But I think either way, they kind of go hand in hand. So I don't necessarily know that you might be right, and I don't think we necessarily have to wrestle that to the ground. Yeah,
All right.
good stuff, man. All right, thank you. God be with you.
And also with you.